Hello from London, I'm Dr. Gareth Popkins and this is the third in my Dr. Popkins Method series of videos. I shot the first one down in Tenerife. It ended with a bit of a splash. If you haven't seen it, you can check out the link underneath this video. In Tenerife, fellow experienced language learners, bloggers and vloggers were challenging me to explain much more clearly how I've managed to get fluent in 4 foreign languages and to develop a working knowledge of several others. Did this amount to a Dr. Popkins method or not? In the second video, I started to tell you my personal language learning story. I began with how I got fluent in French and then in Welsh. Today I want to keep it chronological and move on and tell you the story of how I learned Russian and then German. I'm not aiming here for big dramatic conclusions or generalizations. It's just my story. But it may be that as you listen to it, you will hear similarities with your own language learning experience, or for that matter, that contrasts will strike you, which I think can be equally useful. So let's move right in then to my Russian story. Now, I mentioned that my first year in Wales was a gap year, and I knew that at the end, in the autumn, I was going to be going back to Oxford to start working on my doctorate in history. And I was going to do Russian history. Now this meant I had to learn Russian pretty quickly. I got into Russian history because I was attracted by the exoticness, I think, of Russian history. It was the big questions of history. Revolutions, liberation of the serfs in the 19th century, Tsars, orthodoxy. It was exotic, it was very different. And I knew that choosing that path would give me the reason to learn another language. And Russian seemed a great one to do. It had a rich literature associated with it. It was mysterious because of its script. It sounded so different. And it was an exciting time. It was now 1989, with the communist system collapsing, to get involved in Soviet studies and Russian history. So during my time in Wales, my Welsh was now pretty fluent halfway through. I started to learn Russian as well. When I'd been on my long summer Welsh course, I'd met a retired old gentleman who had learnt Russian many, many years earlier and was a bit of a linguist. And he encouraged me to start with the Penguin Russian course. And I went over to his place actually, over the hills from Aberystwyth to Montgomery a couple of times, I think, and he very kindly helped me out. It was the old Penguin Russian course. And I worked through this. There were some cassette tapes you could get to it. You had to send off for those separately. It wasn't a simple operation, but I got hold of those too. So again, it was one textbook with audio. And then when I got back to Oxford in the autumn, I started working pretty seriously on another textbook, which was this one, Fundamentals of Russian by Horace Lunt, an old book with lots and lots of exercises in it. I worked methodically through this with the help and encouragement of my professor, Norman Stone, an inspiring historian and enthusiastic linguist who basically just gave me the belief that I could do it. He made it maybe sound easier than it was going to be to get fluent in Russian, but with his encouragement and inspiration, you know, I threw myself into it. And there were Russian exchange students more than ever before in Oxford, and I got to know several of those, and they helped me out too. At the same time, I bought another book of vocabulary, the same approach I'd taken with French and Welsh, organised by themes, started to make flashcards and to work on that. And then in summer 1990, with Alexei, one of the Russians I'd got to know in the college, I went over back to the Soviet Union, and I spent a long summer as his guest and being shown Leningrad, Moscow and Kiev, all in one country then, for the first time. And this was a wonderful, really immersive experience. I wasn't studying the language, but it was a real flood of Russian and Soviet culture. And there were difficult times for people because there wasn't much in the shops, but I was given hugely generous hospitality, and I really saw an amazing different world and started to realise how the language would be a bridge into a whole new culture. And by the end of that summer, I could do conversational Russian pretty well. but it was thanks to all the preparatory work and getting a lot of the basics, having covered all the grammar really and a core vocab, I think, before I went, that I was able to then speak. Because the fact was, understanding was difficult because I hadn't had still much audio exposure. The college in Oxford, where I was, St Anthony's, had just got the latest thing, which was satellite television. You could watch Soviet TV, but it was very temperamental. You had to book a slot, and so I hadn't really, heard much Russian. I was trying to listen on the shortwave radio, and I did this for several weeks initially. And I must have been about a week in when I think Alexei came into my room and pointed out that what I was hearing with the sort of woo-woo you got with the shortwave radio at that time wasn't actually Russian, it was Ukrainian. That was pretty discouraging. One other thing I want to mention about my early stage with Russian was that I had started to go to Russian reading classes in the university in Oxford, but I gave them up pretty soon, and I just said straight out to the teacher, I don't think this is an effective method for me. I wanted to speak the language, but also it was very focused on reading, for example, Soviet newspapers, and that wasn't what I was looking for. And this, tells you that maybe I take a very selective approach to using language classes. I do think they have value, but often it's for the social context and definitely as a supplement to being very proactive and doing a lot of listening, reading and study yourself in the language. I then went off to Germany in January 1990 for 8 months, and I'll come back to that in more detail when I talk about my German. But I was now having to read Russian sources because I was in, by this stage, the second year of my doctoral period. I only had 3 years' money, and I was getting very, very nervous because most people, were much further ahead with their research than I was. So I was trying to plough through very difficult Russian sources in the university library in Freiburg, where I was living by this stage. It was really, really pretty difficult. I would read the same text, the same words, looking them up over and over again. It was pretty stilted stuff. It was 19th century Russian legal decisions from the governing Senate, which was the highest court. So it wasn't exactly light reading. So my 8 months in Freiburg came to an end in August 1991. Did I say 1990 earlier on? It was 1991. I know that for certain because I was going off in September 91 for a year in the Soviet Union, working in Leningrad in the Tsarist archives for my research. And the plan was to have a couple of weeks just turning around in the UK. The first night back in the UK, I was staying over at my sister's place, and she woke me up in the morning with a cup of tea. And it was the 19th of August 1991. She said there's been a coup in the Soviet Union, and it was the attempted failed putsch which had happened, and I was speechless. What was going to happen? Not only the fate of Soviet citizens, 300 million of them, but my own research career seemed to hang in the balance. The coup blew over pretty quickly. It was all over by about the 22nd of August, and I was able to go on target on the 1st of September to Leningrad, and I had a wonderful year then. It was, again, a time when history was being made. The Soviet Union was formally dissolved at the end of 1991, and Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, all the other republics became independent. There were massive reforms taking place in the Russian Federation, and price reform in January 1991, the Gaidar government. It was a very tense time. I was working mainly in the archive, but having wonderful experiences with other young Russian and Soviet research students in a hall of residence for the Academy of Sciences. Wonderful experiences, travelling around the country a bit too, and ploughing on with my research work. It was a fascinating time. By this stage, I was already able to speak and read Russian pretty fluently, notwithstanding lots of mistakes, of course, when I was speaking, but the main thing I needed was to be able to read the language. And I continued to go back to Russia when I was then working as a historian throughout the 1990s, and I was back there from 2004, back in Russia from 2004 to 2008, in a new incarnation. By this stage, I had left academic history, and I had been to law school, and I was working as an international lawyer in the Moscow office of an international law firm. During my first full year in Russia back in 1991 to 92, and just before that actually, my career as a pundit through the medium of Welsh on the radio took off. Well, that's an exaggeration, but BBC Radio Cymru, the news service of the Welsh BBC, had somehow got my phone number. And they started calling me, it started during the coup, and asking me to give, be a pundit and give commentary in Welsh on what was going on in Russia. So I started to do that, and they would call me then during the year in Russia for snippets whenever something newsworthy happened. And that's something I continued to do when I became an academic of Russia in Wales. It was an illustration of the way learning a language can open doors you wouldn't have anticipated when you start, even with a so-called lesser used language such as Welsh. The other thing was, and you'll know this if you're regular on the blog, is that I've continued to learn Russian over the years. Language learning for me has very much been a long-term thing with my languages, and over the last 2 or 3 years I've been using exams as a way to help me take my already pretty advanced Russian up to a higher level, focusing particularly on writing skills. I had to retake, but finally did pass the advanced C1 TRKI third certificate in Russian, which has been a source of huge satisfaction. But I know I've got a long way to go still. Russian for me, as with my other high-level languages, is it's a lifelong engagement, I think, with the language.
I've already mentioned that in 1991, for the first 8 months of the year, I was living in Freiburg. I was a postgraduate student working on Russian history, and I took the opportunity to go on an exchange to Germany to try and get fluent in the language. Now, I'd started learning German the year before, and I'd adopted very much a similar approach to what I'd used with my other languages. That's to say, I started with a good course materials. This was this time Teach Yourself German by Paul Kogel, which had great audio with it. It came with cassettes, and I worked a lot with this book and with the audio. And got all the way through it before I went to the country. So I'd covered all the main structures and the core vocabulary from this book. I'd also started systematically to work through different areas of vocabulary with another themed vocab book, this one, which again I used flashcards with to work through. So I had my first stay in Germany. It was a wonderfully interesting time to be there because I arrived only very, very shortly after reunification. There was a lot going on, therefore, with the country being reformed, really. Politically, it was an exciting time and a worrying time with the first Iraq war going on. I was getting on with my Russian research, I mentioned earlier, struggling to read Russian texts, but also using German, just German really, in my life outside my studies. So I was taking part in university seminars, and I was also socializing in German a lot. I had to find a room on my own first of all, just using German. I lodged with an old lady in the outskirts of Freiburg, and I spoke a lot of German with her, and I met lots of people my own age and really had a good conversational level by the time it came to the August when I went back briefly to the UK before heading out to Russia. Now, it didn't end there with me, with German, because as has happened a lot with my language learning, it's happened in phases. And a couple of years later, I went back to the language because I got the opportunity to go and work in Heidelberg University as a research assistant in the Russian Studies department, the Russian History department. Before I did that, I did a long summer course with the Goethe Institute. I was in the Mittelstufe now, sort of middle level, to work on my German. So that was an intensive taught course. I think it was a 2-month course. And at the end of that, I was able to pass the language exam to matriculate officially in Heidelberg University, where I then worked. And I spent 3 years altogether in Heidelberg, working for one of my doctoral supervisors, Heinz Löwe, who had moved from Oxford to take up the chair in Heidelberg for the first year as a part-time research assistant, while trying to write up my Russian work. And then working as a waiter and an English teacher in Heidelberg. I was speaking German all the time. My written work was in English. My sources, as mentioned already, were in Russian. But I had a very, very active social life in German. I was sharing accommodation with Germans. What I wasn't doing really was reading the language much. And I sort of, looking back, think that I got to a plateau with my German where it was pretty good upper intermediate level, functionally fluent, but that's where it then stayed for the next, I don't know, 15 years. I had good friends in Germany. I would go to Germany every few years, keeping in touch with them. A lot of those people were Russian studies people as well, so we'd sometimes meet up in Moscow or at conferences about Russia. And then in the last few years I decided to work again on my German, and you'll know if you follow the blog that I took the German C1 exam with the Goethe Institute over in Berlin, and had to prepare very hard for that, but passed it quite well, particularly the speaking side. Again, it was my writing that I had to do extra really focused practice on. So I'd got on to what I would call an even plateau with German, and in recent years then I've been working to take that forward and move up a gear yet again. So that's the story of how I've got pretty fluent in Russian and German over the years. Now you might think, oh, that's okay for you, Gareth. You obviously have some sort of talent for languages, plus you were a student when you started learning, so you had the time plus the opportunity to go to the countries to practice your languages. And there's some truth in all of that. But I want to tackle head on in the next video my own personal strengths and weaknesses as a language learner, because it just doesn't wash to say somebody has got a talent for languages and somebody has not. Actually, we've all got different strengths and weaknesses, and I think our job is to understand what they are and then to play to them. Similarly with our life situations, mine has changed now, I'm holding down a job. How's that affected the way I learn Basque? So I want to look at the talent question and the sort of choices we can make in our language learning lives. That's the topic of the next video. See you next time.